My stepsister fabricated lies that got me kicked out by my mother when I was 12. Now they want my money, and when I refused to help them, they sued me. Hey everyone, I'm Veronica. I'm 32 now, but this story begins when I was just a child, around 10 years old. Back then, life felt secure and predictable. It was me, my mother Caroline, and my father Anthony. My father was everything a dad should be: intelligent, patient, and endlessly supportive. He was a brilliant lawyer who always made time for me, helping with homework, teaching me chess, and sharing stories about justice and fairness that would shape my understanding of the world. Those early years felt like a golden time, filled with family dinners where we discuss everything from current events to my dreams for the future. But life has a cruel way of shattering our sense of security without warning. When I was 10, my parents' marriage began to crumble. I didn't understand the complexity of adult relationships then, but I could feel the tension suffocating our once happy home. The hushed arguments late at night, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the forced smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. Within a year, they were divorced, and the custody arrangement split my world in half. I spent weekdays with my mother Caroline and weekends with my father Anthony. At first, it seemed manageable. Dad made our weekend time special. We'd visit museums, work on puzzles, and he'd patiently answer my endless questions about law and life. He never spoke badly about my mother, always encouraging me to respect her and maintain that relationship. Family is complicated, sweetheart, he'd say, but love should never be conditional. Caroline, however, seemed eager to erase those weekend visits from existence. She'd make snide comments about my father, roll her eyes when I mentioned our activities, and gradually began to resent the time I spent away from her. I was too young to understand that she was struggling with her own sense of failure and abandonment. All I knew was that the woman who used to read me bedtime stories now seemed irritated by my very presence. Then, barely 2 years after the divorce, everything changed again. Caroline started dating Marcus, a loud, domineering man who worked in construction and had opinions about everything. Marcus wasn't just confident, he was aggressively certain about his worldview, and he expected everyone around him to fall in line. He had a daughter from his previous marriage, Isabella, who was 4 years older than me and had mastered the art of manipulation by age 16. From the moment Marcus and Isabella entered our lives, I could sense the shift. Suddenly, our quiet household became a stage for Marcus's booming voice and Isabella's dramatic performances. Caroline, who had once been independent and strong-willed, began deferring to Marcus on every decision, as if his approval had become her lifeline. The first major red flag should have been the way they moved in. Not gradually, not with discussion or family meetings, but like an occupying force taking over territory. I came home from school one Tuesday to find Marcus's pickup truck in our driveway, Isabella lounging in our living room like she owned the place. "Surprise!" Caroline announced with forced cheerfulness. "Marcus and Isabella are going to be staying with us for a while." A while turned into permanent residency within a month. And with that permanency came a complete reorganization of our home according to Marcus's preferences and Isabella's demands. My bedroom, the space that had been my sanctuary, filled with books, art supplies, and memories of better times, suddenly became Isabella's domain. She walked in one day, surveyed my room like a real estate appraiser, and declared, "This room has better light for my art projects. Plus, I'm older, so I should get the bigger space." Instead of defending my right to my own room, Caroline just nodded along. "That makes sense, honey. Veronica can move into the guest room. It'll be cozy." Cozy. That's what she called shoving me into a space barely large enough for a single bed and a dresser. My art easel that my father had bought me? Relegated to the garage. The bookshelf full of novels and poetry collections? Moved to the basement where they'd gather dust and moisture. My desk where I did homework and wrote in my journal? Replaced with Isabella's vanity mirror and an explosion of makeup and hair products. "But Mom," I protested weakly, "this is my room. I've had it since we moved here." Caroline's face hardened. Veronica, we need to be flexible. We're building a new family here, and that means making sacrifices. Isabella is older and has more complex needs. Complex needs. As if my need for personal space and stability was somehow less valid than Isabella's desire for better lighting. But the room was just the beginning. Marcus had opinions about everything: how I should speak, more confidence. Stop mumbling, how I should dress, that outfit makes you look sloppy, how I should spend my time, less reading, more helping around the house, and especially how I should treat Isabella. She's your big sister now, show some respect. The phrase big sister made my skin crawl. Isabella wasn't my sister in any meaningful sense. She was a stranger who had invaded my life and seemed determined to make me as miserable as possible. But according to Marcus, I was being difficult and resistant to change whenever I didn't immediately embrace his version of family dynamics. Caroline, meanwhile, had transformed into someone I barely recognized. The woman who used to defend me against playground bullies now sat silently while Marcus criticized everything about me. When I'd look to her for support during his lectures, she'd either nod in agreement or study her hands like they held the secrets of the universe. Your mother and I are trying to build something here, Marcus would say, his voice taking on that condescending tone that made my teeth clench. But you seem determined to make everything difficult. I wasn't trying to make anything difficult. I was 12 years old, grieving the loss of my normal life, and desperately trying to hold on to some sense of myself in a house that no longer felt like home. If I thought the living situation was bad, Isabella's behavior made it infinitely worse. She had perfected the art of being sweet and innocent in front of the adults while being absolutely vicious when we were alone. It was like living with a skilled con artist who happened to be a teenager. In front of Marcus and Caroline, Isabella was the perfect daughter, helpful, respectful, ambitious. She'd volunteer to cook dinner, badly, offer to help with household chores, which she'd abandon halfway through, and talk about her dreams of becoming an artist with such passion that even I almost believed her. Isabella has such a bright future ahead of her, Marcus would beam, as if her mediocre sketches were gallery-worthy masterpieces. She's going places, that one. Caroline would nod enthusiastically, praising Isabella's creativity and dedication. It was nauseating to watch, especially since I knew the real Isabella, the one who stole my art supplies, who copied my homework when she thought no one was looking, and who had somehow convinced herself that everything good in my life was something she deserved instead. But Isabella's true talent wasn't art, it was manipulation. She had an uncanny ability to create chaos and then position herself as the innocent victim. A typical scenario would unfold like this: Isabella would borrow something of mine without asking, I'd confront her about it, she'd twist the conversation until I was somehow the aggressor, and then she'd run to Marcus with tears in her eyes about how mean I was being to her. I just wanted to borrow a pencil for my art project, she'd sob, and Veronica started screaming at me for no reason. Of course, she'd leave out the part where the pencil was actually my expensive art set that my father had given me, or that her borrowing meant taking it without permission and getting paint all over my pristine supplies. Marcus would storm into my room, his face red with anger. What is wrong with you? Isabella is trying to be nice, and you're treating her like garbage. This behavior stops now. Any attempt to explain my side of the story would be dismissed as making excuses or being disrespectful. Caroline would hover in the background, occasionally making weak sounds of agreement with whatever Marcus said. The worst part wasn't even the injustice of it all. It was watching my mother transform into someone who valued peace over truth, harmony over her own daughter's well-being. Every time she chose Isabella's version of events over mine, every time she let Marcus discipline me for things I didn't do, every time she stayed silent when I needed her to speak up, a piece of my trust in her died. By the time I turned 12, I had learned to navigate this toxic dynamic by becoming invisible. I spent most of my time in my cramped room, did my chores without complaint, and tried to avoid giving anyone a reason to notice me. It was survival mode, and I had become very good at it. But invisibility only works if the people around you are willing to ignore you. Isabella, unfortunately, thrived on attention and conflict. And when she realized I was trying to stay under the radar, she decided to drag me back into the spotlight in the most destructive way possible. The setup began on what should have been one of the best days of my 12-year-old life. I had just received my report card, and for the first time ever, I had straight A's. Math, which had always been my nemesis, finally clicked thanks to hours of extra studying and my father's patient tutoring during our weekend visits. When my teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, handed me the report card with a genuine smile and said, "Your hard work really paid off, Veronica," I felt the surge of pride that I hadn't experienced in months. I practically floated home, clutching that report card like it was a lottery ticket. For once, I had something undeniably positive to share, something that even Marcus couldn't criticize or dismiss. I imagined Caroline's face lighting up with pride, maybe even a rare moment of praise that wasn't immediately overshadowed by comparisons to Isabella. But when I walked through the front door, Isabella was waiting for me with that calculating look I had learned to fear. "Hey, little sis," she said, using the nickname that always made my skin crawl. "You look happy. Good day at school?" I should have known better than to share anything positive with her, but I was still naive enough to hope that maybe, just maybe, she might actually be happy for me. "I got straight A's," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. "Even in math?" Isabella's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Wow, that's amazing. Can I see?" I handed her the report card and she studied it with what looked like genuine interest. "This is really impressive, Veronica. You should be proud." For a moment, I actually believed she meant it. Then she handed the report card back and said, "You know what would be even more impressive? If you could help me with my art project. I'm working on this portfolio for college applications, and I could really use some of your attention to detail." "Sure," I said, still riding the high of my academic success. "What do you need help with?" "Well, I've been struggling with this one piece. It's supposed to be really personal and meaningful, and I just can't get it right. Could you maybe let me borrow some of your art supplies? The good ones your dad bought you?" I hesitated. Those art supplies were precious to me, not just because they were expensive, but because they represented my father's belief in my creativity and potential. But Isabella was being so nice, so genuinely appreciative, that I found myself nodding. "Okay, but please be careful with them. They're really important to me." "Of course. I'll treat them like they're made of gold." She disappeared into what used to be my room, and I went to the kitchen to start on homework. Caroline was at work, and Marcus wouldn't be home for another hour, so the house was actually peaceful for once. I spread my books across the kitchen table and dove into my assignments, still buzzing with satisfaction from my report card. About an hour later, Isabella emerged from her room with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something almost excited about the way she moved, like she was barely containing some kind of energy. "Hey Veronica," she said, "I think I left one of your paintbrushes in the living room. Could you help me find it?" I followed her into the living room, where she began moving couch cushions and looking under furniture with theatrical concern. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone that always preceded trouble. "I was being so careful, but I think it might have rolled under the coffee table." We searched for several minutes, but there was no paintbrush to be found. Isabella kept apologizing profusely, insisting that she was usually more responsible than this. Something about the whole performance felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "Don't worry about it," I finally said. "I'm sure it'll turn up." "You're so understanding," Isabella gushed. "I don't know what I did to deserve such a sweet little sister." The next morning, my world exploded. I was in first period English when the classroom door opened and Mrs. Rodriguez walked in with a grim expression. She whispered something to my teacher, who looked surprised and then concerned. "Veronica," my teacher said, "please gather your things. You need to go to the principal's office." The walk down the hallway felt like a death march. I racked my brain trying to think of what I could have possibly done wrong. I was a good student, never caused trouble, always followed the rules. Maybe there was some kind of administrative error, or perhaps my father needed to pick me up early for some reason. But when I walked into Principal Davidson's office, I knew immediately that this wasn't about early dismissal or paperwork mistakes. Isabella was sitting in one of the chairs facing the principal's desk, and she was crying. Not the fake tears she usually deployed for Marcus's benefit, but what looked like genuine, heartbroken sobs. Principal Davidson looked up at me with a mixture of disappointment and sadness that made my stomach drop. "Veronica," he said slowly, "please have a seat." I sat down in the chair next to Isabella, who immediately scooted away from me like I was contaminated. She wouldn't even look at me. "I'm going to get straight to the point," Principal Davidson continued. "We found stolen property in your backpack this morning. Specifically, several tubes of expensive oil paint that belonged to the art department." My brain completely short-circuited. "I'm sorry, what?" He opened his desk drawer and pulled out 3 tubes of paint that I recognized immediately. They were the exact same brand and colors as the ones my father had bought me for my art set. These paints were reported missing from Ms. Chen's art classroom yesterday afternoon. When we checked your backpack during a routine locker inspection, we found them hidden in the bottom. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't take those. I have my own paints at home." Isabella let out a fresh sob. "She's lying, Mr. Davidson. I saw her take them." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I stared at Isabella, trying to process what she had just said. "What?" "I'm so sorry, Veronica," Isabella cried, "but I can't lie for you anymore. I saw you slip those paints into your backpack after art class yesterday. I told you it was wrong, but you said you needed them for some project and that nobody would notice." "That's not true," I protested. "Isabella, tell him the truth." But Isabella just shook her head sadly, as if she was heartbroken by my denial. "I really hoped you would confess on your own. I kept waiting for you to do the right thing." Principal Davidson looked at me with profound disappointment. "Veronica, this is very serious. Theft is grounds for immediate expulsion." "But I didn't do it." "She's lying." "Isabella came to me voluntarily this morning," he said. She was clearly struggling with her conscience about what she witnessed. Why would she make this up? I looked at Isabella, searching her face for any sign of the person who had been so sweet to me just yesterday, who had borrowed my art supplies and praised my report card. But all I saw was calculated devastation, the performance of a lifetime. And in that moment, I understood. The art supplies, the missing paintbrush, the overly nice behavior, it had all been a setup. She had used my own paints to frame me, probably planted them in my backpack when I was in the bathroom or distracted. The missing paintbrush search had been an excuse to be alone with my backpack. But who would believe me? A 12-year-old claiming that her older stepsister had orchestrated an elaborate frame job? It sounded paranoid and desperate, even to my own ears. Principal Davidson made the call to Caroline, and within an hour, both she and Marcus were sitting in his office. The disappointment in Caroline's eyes was like a physical blow, but Marcus's reaction was far worse. "Theft?" he exploded. "You're telling me she's a thief?" "I didn't steal anything," I said quietly, but my protest was drowned out by Marcus's continued outrage. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he continued. "All this secretive behavior, all this attitude, I knew something like this would happen." Caroline didn't say a word in my defense. She just sat there, staring at her hands, while Marcus ranted about my supposed moral failings and Isabella sniffled dramatically in the corner. When we got home, Marcus's verdict was swift and final. "Pack your things," he told me. "You're not staying in this house." I looked at Caroline, waiting for her to intervene, to demand more time to figure things out, to at least question whether there might be more to the story. Instead, she just nodded slowly. Maybe it's for the best, she said quietly. Maybe you'll be better off with your father. Better off. As if my life falling apart was somehow a favor they were doing me. That night, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and a garbage bag, trying not to cry as I folded clothes and gathered the few possessions that Isabella hadn't claimed were ruined. As I worked, I could hear Marcus on the phone with my father, explaining the situation in terms that made me sound like a juvenile delinquent. She stole art supplies from school, he was saying. Expensive ones. The principal said it was grounds for expulsion. Caroline and I just can't have that kind of behavior in our house, especially with Isabella here. We need to protect her from this kind of influence. I wanted to scream, to tell my father the truth, to explain that this was all part of Isabella's sick game, but when he arrived to pick me up, the disappointment in his eyes mirrored what I had seen in everyone else's face that day. As I carried my bags to his car, Isabella appeared in the doorway. She waved goodbye with that same sweet smile she had given me when she asked to borrow my art supplies. "I'll miss you, little sis," she called out. "Take care of yourself." Caroline didn't even come outside to say goodbye. But Marcus didn't just kick me out over the stolen paint accusation or even his usual disrespectful, ungrateful routine. Oh no, he decided to unleash every petty grievance he'd been stockpiling for 2 years, no matter how absurd or irrelevant. Like he'd been keeping a mental scorecard, just waiting for the perfect moment to dump it all on a 12-year-old. First, Marcus accused me of ruining Isabella's sweet 16 party last year. What did I do? Did I crash the cake table? Did I start a fight with her friends? Nope. I spent most of the party in my room because Isabella had specifically told me I wasn't welcome to embarrass her in front of her high school friends. But somehow, my absence made me selfish and antisocial. Never mind that I'd saved up 3 months of allowance to buy her a professional art set that she never even used. According to Marcus, I'd failed to support family celebrations, so clearly I was a terrible sister. Then he brought up the infamous internet incident. A few weeks ago, Isabella and I had a disagreement about bandwidth because she wanted to live stream some makeup tutorial while I needed to video call my father for help with homework. Apparently, asking her to wait 30 minutes was proof that I didn't respect her entrepreneurial ambitions. Marcus actually said, "Your homework could wait, but Isabella's building her brand. She's thinking about her future." Right, Marcus. Because makeup tutorials on Instagram are definitely more important than my education. But the absolute peak of his delusion was when he blamed me for Isabella's failed art school application. I wasn't even aware she'd applied until Marcus started screaming about how my negative energy in the house had affected her creativity. He claimed that my sullen attitude had somehow psychically interfered with her artistic process. For the record, Isabella's portfolio was rejected because she'd submitted the same 3 mediocre drawings she'd been recycling since middle school, not because of my alleged toxic presence. The girl got rejected from community college art classes, by the way. But Marcus conveniently forgot to mention that part during his rant. So there I was, sitting in my father's car with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag, wondering how I'd become the designated villain in every family drama. If you're curious whether I heard from them after I left? Not a single call, text, or even a postcard. But knowing Marcus, he probably found a way to blame me for the next power outage. Moving back in with my father Anthony felt like stepping out of a nightmare and into reality. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't have to monitor every word I said or brace myself for the next manufactured crisis. Dad didn't yell, didn't create impossible standards, and most importantly, he didn't treat me like a burden he was stuck with. He gave me space to heal and figure out who I really was beneath all that damage. Initially, I didn't know how to function without constant criticism. I was angry, at Marcus, at Isabella, at my mother, and honestly, at myself for believing their version of me for so long. Dad noticed, but he didn't force conversations or demand immediate forgiveness. Instead, he handed me a thick legal textbook one evening and said, "Your grandmother always said knowledge is the best defense against injustice. Want to learn how the world really works? I didn't expect to find it interesting, but I started reading anyway. Something about understanding laws and rights felt empowering. It gave me a sense of control I hadn't experienced in years. When I showed him the notes I'd been taking, Dad smiled and said, "You've got a sharp legal mind. Maybe you should consider putting it to good use." That conversation changed everything. Around the same time, I started getting interested in real estate. My grandmother had left me a small inheritance that I wasn't supposed to access until I turned 18, but Dad helped me understand how property investment worked. He'd been quietly managing the funds, turning my grandmother's modest bequest into something much more substantial through careful market analysis and strategic purchases. By the time I finished high school, I had a clear plan. I'd study part-time while learning the real estate business, combining Dad's legal expertise with my own instinct for profitable investments. I wasn't trying to get rich quick, but I liked the idea of building something solid, something that couldn't be taken away or manipulated. Meanwhile, my mother, Marcus, and Isabella remained in the background like a toxic soap opera I'd stopped watching. Caroline sent occasional guilt-trip texts in the first year, things like "I hope you're happy now" or "families should stick together." She never apologized or acknowledged what had actually happened. Marcus? Complete radio silence, which suited me perfectly. Isabella, however, couldn't resist periodic attempts to get under my skin. She'd send screenshots of expensive purchases or fake sympathy messages like "I'm sorry Dad was so hard on you," followed immediately by "BTW, look at my new designer purse." It annoyed me initially, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of a response. Instead, I channeled that irritation into motivation. By 22, I was managing a small but profitable real estate portfolio. Nothing flashy, just solid rental properties in good neighborhoods that generated steady income. Dad was my mentor and business partner, teaching me everything from contract law to market analysis. Local investors started seeking my advice on property assessments. One afternoon, Dad handed me the deed to my latest acquisition, a duplex that would double my monthly rental income. "You've built something impressive," he said. "Never let anyone convince you otherwise." After years of being told I was worthless, hearing genuine pride in someone's voice felt like everything. When I was 25, Caroline showed up unannounced at my father's house. I was in the middle of reviewing property investment reports when I heard the doorbell. Dad answered it, and the next thing I knew, she was standing awkwardly in our living room. She looked terrible. Exhausted. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes looked like she'd slept in them, and she had this desperate, hollow look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "Veronica," she said quietly, like she was approaching a wild animal. "I needed to see you." I stared at her, unsure what to say. She fidgeted for a moment, then added, "Things have been really difficult lately. Marcus lost his construction contract, and Isabella's struggling with finding direction. We're barely keeping our heads above water." Translation: we're broke and we need money. I waited for her to get to the actual point, and predictably, she did. "I know you've been doing well with your real estate investments. Maybe you could help us out, just temporarily until we stabilize." I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. "You want me to financially rescue you after everything you put me through?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Her face crumpled. "Veronica, I know I made some poor decisions." "Poor decisions?" I interrupted. "You chose Marcus over your own daughter. You let Isabella frame me for theft, and then you threw me out like garbage. Those weren't poor decisions, Mom. Those were deliberate choices." She didn't try to deny it. Instead, she started crying, which only hardened my resolve. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I should have protected you better." "Yes, you should have," I said coldly. "But you didn't. And now you expect me to bail you out? To help Isabella? You must be delusional." She had no response to that. I stood there for a moment, studying the woman who gave birth to me, and realized something profound. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no pity, nothing. "I don't owe you anything," I said finally. "And I certainly don't owe Isabella." Before she could manufacture more tears, I left the room. Dad was waiting in his study, and when I sat down across from his desk, he gave me an approving nod. "You handled that perfectly," he said. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace with my choices. That confrontation with Caroline marked a turning point in my thinking. I stopped wasting mental energy hoping she'd change or acknowledge her failures. Instead, I channeled everything into building the life I deserved, one where I never again had to depend on people who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. By my mid-20s, my real estate portfolio was generating serious income. I wasn't just making money, I was building wealth. I completed my real estate license, taken advanced courses in property law, and developed a reputation among local investors as someone with excellent market instincts and ironclad contract knowledge. By 28, my investment strategy had evolved from small rental properties to commercial real estate and property development. I was acquiring undervalued buildings, renovating them strategically, and either flipping them for profit or holding them for long-term rental income. It wasn't flashy work, but it was incredibly satisfying and financially rewarding. I'd purchased a beautiful townhouse in the city's historic district, nothing ostentatious, but elegant and completely mine. No shared spaces, no compromise on decorating choices, no walking on eggshells around volatile personalities. Meanwhile, my former family continued their downward spiral. Isabella's fantasy life imploded first. She'd somehow convinced a local art gallery to feature her work in a group show, probably through manipulation and sob stories. But when actual art critics reviewed the exhibition, her pieces were described as derivative and technically incompetent. The gallery quietly removed her work after the first week, and Isabella's brief moment of artistic legitimacy evaporated completely. Marcus wasn't faring any better. His construction business had always operated in legal gray areas, but apparently he'd gotten careless. Word spread through our small community that he'd been caught inflating invoices and using substandard materials on several projects. Multiple lawsuits were filed, and his contractor's license was suspended pending investigation. And Caroline? She was trapped in the wreckage, still clinging to a marriage that was destroying her financially and socially. I wasn't actively monitoring their situation. I'd blocked Isabella on all social media platforms years ago, and Caroline's increasingly desperate texts went straight to my spam folder. But in a small town, news travels fast. Dad occasionally mentioned updates he'd heard through his legal network. "Your mother's house went into foreclosure," he told me one evening over dinner. "I see," I said, continuing to cut my steak. "Marcus is facing criminal charges. Fraud, apparently." I felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no sympathy, no vindication. They were simply irrelevant to my life now. "They're staying in some rental apartment across town," Dad added. "Isabella moved back in with them." "Of course she did," I said mildly. Dad studied my face carefully. "You're really done with all of them, aren't you?" I met his eyes. Completely. And I meant it. Their self-inflicted destruction was just background noise in my successful, peaceful life. A few weeks later, I received a text from Caroline. "Hi Veronica, we need to talk." I stared at my phone for a solid 10 minutes before replying, "What do you want now?" She didn't respond immediately, but when she finally did, it was precisely what I'd anticipated. "We're in a really desperate situation right now. Marcus is facing serious legal issues, Isabella can't find stable work, and we're drowning financially. You're doing so incredibly well with your real estate business. I thought maybe you could help us through this crisis." I couldn't believe the sheer audacity. "You want me to financially rescue the people who destroyed my childhood? Are you completely delusional?" I texted back. "I know we've made some serious mistakes, but we're still family. That bond has to mean something," she replied, as if family ties could erase years of abuse and neglect. Family? That's rich. It meant something when I was 12 and you chose Marcus and Isabella over your own daughter. It meant something when you threw me out based on lies. But now? When you need money? Not a chance. Don't contact me again. I blocked her number immediately. It wasn't about being vindictive, it was about maintaining the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. But Caroline, true to form, refused to accept defeat gracefully. 3 months later, I was reviewing quarterly reports for my rental properties when my doorbell rang. A process server stood on my doorstep with legal documents that made my blood run cold. Caroline was suing me, along with Marcus and Isabella as co-plaintiffs. They were claiming I had a legal obligation to provide financial support to my struggling family members and demanding $500,000 in immediate assistance plus ongoing monthly payments. My first reaction was genuine laughter. The absurdity was almost impressive. But as I read through their legal arguments, my amusement quickly transformed into cold fury. This wasn't just a desperate money grab, they'd actually hired an attorney and were attempting to use the court system to extort me. Fortunately, I had the perfect ally. Dad immediately connected me with his former law partner, Jonathan Mills, a brilliant attorney who specialized in family law. When I showed him the lawsuit, his expression shifted from professional interest to barely contained outrage. "This is the most frivolous case I've seen in 30 years of practice," he said flatly. "They're essentially arguing that financial success creates an obligation to support people who treated you abusively. It's legally groundless and morally reprehensible." When our court date arrived, I was prepared. Jonathan had helped me compile 20 years of documentation, the records of their financial irresponsibility, evidence of the emotional abuse I'd endured, testimony from teachers and neighbors who'd witnessed their treatment of me, and detailed proof of my own legitimate success through hard work and sound investments. Caroline took the stand first, delivering a performance worthy of a soap opera. She sobbed about her difficult circumstances, claimed Marcus had manipulated her decisions, and insisted she'd always loved me despite her inability to show it. She painted herself as a victim of both Marcus's influence and life's cruel circumstances. The judge listened with visible skepticism, occasionally glancing at the mountain of evidence Jonathan had presented. Isabella followed with an even more dramatic display, claiming I'd abandoned the family in their time of need and that my success was somehow built on resources that rightfully belonged to all of us. She actually argued that my inheritance from my grandmother should have been shared with her because we were sisters. By the time she finished her testimony, I could see the judge's patience had completely evaporated. When Jonathan presented our defense, the contrast was stark. Cold, hard facts. Documentation of abuse. Evidence of their financial mismanagement and my independent success. Character witnesses who testified to my integrity and their toxic behavior. The judge's dismissal was swift and scathing. "This case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of both family obligation and legal responsibility. Ms. Veronica has no duty to subsidize the poor choices of adults who treated her with cruelty and then severed their relationship with her." As we left the courthouse, Caroline's mask finally slipped completely. "You think you're so much better than us," she snarled. "But you'll get what's coming to you." I looked her directly in the eyes and smiled. I already got what was coming to me. Success, peace, and freedom from all of you. For the first time in my life, I felt completely victorious. So after the complete courtroom humiliation, you'd assume Caroline and Isabella would finally disappear from my orbit permanently, right? Wrong. They're like a persistent virus. You think you've eliminated them, but they keep mutating and finding new ways to cause problems. Several months after our legal victory, my life had settled into a beautiful rhythm. My real estate portfolio was generating substantial passive income. I just closed on a luxury condo development project, and I was even considering expanding into commercial property management. My professional reputation was stellar, my personal life was peaceful, and I was finally living completely on my own terms. Then one evening, I received a LinkedIn notification. Isabella had somehow found my professional profile and sent me a connection request. Against my better judgment, curiosity won, and I clicked through to her page. What I found was absolutely astounding. Isabella had reinvented herself as a successful entrepreneur and real estate consultant. Her profile was filled with photos of expensive properties that clearly weren't hers, testimonials that sounded fabricated, and a biography claiming years of experience in markets she'd never worked in. She was advertising herself as an expert in luxury property investment and commercial development. But the truly infuriating part? She was using my actual project photos and claiming credit for deals I'd negotiated. One of my most successful property flips, a historic building I converted into high-end lofts, was featured prominently in her portfolio as her own achievement. I was absolutely furious. I immediately sent her a direct message: remove my projects from your profile immediately or face legal consequences. Her response came within minutes: I have no idea what you're talking about. These are my legitimate business accomplishments. I replied, I have documentation proving every aspect of those deals. Take them down now, or my attorney will be in touch tomorrow. She blocked me instantly, clearly hoping I'd just let it slide. Big mistake. If Isabella wanted to escalate this into a professional matter, I was more than prepared for that battle. I contacted Jonathan Mills again and began compiling evidence, contracts with my signature, bank records showing my investments, photographs of me at the properties during renovations, and client testimonials specifically naming me as their agent. Within 48 hours, Jonathan had sent Isabella a cease and desist letter demanding she remove all fraudulent claims and issue a public retraction. We also reported her to LinkedIn for profile fraud and contacted the State Real Estate Licensing Board about her unlicensed practice claims. The response was swift and satisfying. LinkedIn suspended her account, the licensing board launched an investigation, and Isabella's desperate attempts to build credibility through my achievements crumbled completely. But apparently, public humiliation still wasn't enough to teach her the lesson she desperately needed to learn. But then Isabella crossed the line I never imagined she'd be desperate enough to cross. One evening, I returned to my townhouse to find 2 police officers waiting on my front steps. Someone had filed an anonymous report claiming I was operating an unlicensed real estate investment scheme, complete with fabricated evidence suggesting I was defrauding elderly clients. The evidence was a masterwork of amateur deception, poorly altered bank statements, fake client complaints, and forged documents that supposedly proved I was running illegal investment scams. Someone had clearly spent considerable time crafting this elaborate frame job. Fortunately, I'm meticulous about documentation. I maintain detailed records of every transaction, property acquisition, client interaction, and legal filing. My attorney dad had trained me well. Every deal was properly licensed, fully documented, and completely legitimate. It took several hours, but I was able to provide the officers with comprehensive proof of my legitimate business operations. Still, having my professional integrity questioned was infuriating, and I wasn't about to let this malicious attack slide without consequences. I immediately hired Marcus Chen, a private investigator who specialized in digital forensics and fraud cases. Within 72 hours, he traced the fake reports back to their source. Surprise, surprise, the anonymous tips had originated from Isabella's IP address, with additional evidence pointing to involvement from some loser boyfriend named Derek who apparently fancied himself a master manipulator. They'd been coordinating their harassment campaign through encrypted messaging apps, but Derek had been sloppy with his digital security. Marcus recovered their entire conversation thread, which revealed months of planning to destroy Veronica's reputation and force me to share the family wealth. I pressed criminal charges for filing false police reports, attempted fraud, and defamation. Derek immediately panicked when investigators showed up at his door, throwing Isabella completely under the bus and claiming she'd manipulated him into participating. The recovered text messages painted a different picture, though. They were enthusiastic co-conspirators who genuinely believed they could terrorize me into submission. Both received substantial fines and community service, plus restraining orders prohibiting any further contact with me. Isabella's increasingly desperate behavior had finally earned her an official criminal record, and word spread quickly through our community about her fraudulent schemes. I assumed that public humiliation and legal consequences would finally teach them the lesson they so desperately needed. But apparently, Isabella's capacity for self-destructive behavior was even deeper than I'd imagined. 3 months later, I discovered that my downtown office building had been broken into. I'd recently purchased and renovated a beautiful historic property that served as both an investment and my professional headquarters. The building wasn't flashy, but it was my pride and joy, a tangible symbol of everything I'd accomplished through hard work and sound business decisions. Walking into my office that Monday morning to find the space completely ransacked was devastating. File cabinets had been overturned, computer equipment was missing, and several irreplaceable items were gone, including original architectural plans for my current development projects and sentimental pieces from my grandmother's estate that I kept in my office safe. Initially, I assumed it was a random commercial burglary. But when I reviewed the security footage with the investigating officers, the truth was far more personal and disturbing. There was Isabella, captured in high-definition color video, breaking into my building at 2 a.m. wearing a dark hoodie and sunglasses like some kind of discount movie villain. She'd somehow obtained a key to the building, probably through social engineering or bribing a maintenance worker, and had spent over an hour methodically destroying my office and stealing anything that looked valuable. I filed an immediate police report and provided the detectives with the crystal-clear video evidence. When they arrived at Isabella's apartment that afternoon, she tried her usual performance of confused innocence, but the evidence was absolutely overwhelming. Not only was she caught on multiple security cameras, but she'd been incredibly stupid about disposing of the stolen items. Several pieces from my grandmother's jewelry collection were discovered in her possession, and she'd actually posted photos of my missing architectural plans on her social media, claiming they were inspiration pieces for her latest design project. The stolen items were eventually recovered, but many had been damaged beyond repair during her amateur burglary. My grandmother's antique watch, which had immense sentimental value, was found broken and missing several components. This time, Isabella faced serious felony charges for breaking and entering, theft, and destruction of property. At this point, I was absolutely finished. Finished with Isabella, finished with Caroline, finished with Marcus, and finished with their entire toxic circus. I upgraded security at my office building with state-of-the-art surveillance systems, hired a professional security company for regular patrols, and made the conscious decision to focus exclusively on building the life I deserved. Since Isabella's felony arrest and conviction, the silence from that side of my family has been deafening and absolutely perfect. Caroline and Isabella have vanished from my social media feeds, stopped their pathetic attempts at contact, and finally seem to understand that their bridges are permanently burned. Marcus is serving a 3-year sentence for construction fraud and tax evasion, while Derek disappeared from Isabella's life the moment her criminal charges became public knowledge. As for me, I'm not just surviving, I'm absolutely flourishing. My real estate portfolio has grown to include 12 rental properties and 2 commercial developments, generating enough passive income to fund my next ambitious project, a luxury apartment complex in the city's revitalized downtown district. I've also established the Anthony Miller Foundation, named after my father, which provides housing assistance and legal aid to young people who've been abandoned or abused by their families. The foundation has become my greatest source of personal satisfaction. Every month, I receive letters from teenagers and young adults who've escaped toxic family situations and built successful, independent lives. Their stories remind me that choosing yourself over blood relatives isn't selfish, it's essential for survival and growth. My relationship with Dad has never been stronger. We have dinner together every Sunday, and he's now my official business partner in several investment ventures. He often tells me how proud he is of the woman I've become, and how my grandmother would have been amazed to see what I accomplished with her modest inheritance. Just last week, I closed on my biggest deal yet, a historic hotel renovation that will transform a neglected landmark into premium condominiums. Standing in the lobby of that beautiful old building, reviewing contracts that will net me nearly $2 million in profit, I couldn't help but think about 12-year-old me, sitting in that cramped guest room, believing Isabella's lies had destroyed my future. The best part? I built this empire entirely through my own intelligence, determination, and ethical business practices. Every success belongs completely to me. To anyone out there trapped in toxic family dynamics, let me share what I've learned. You don't owe loyalty to people who choose to harm you. Blood relation doesn't grant anyone the right to abuse, manipulate, or exploit you. The family that truly matters is the one that supports your growth, celebrates your success, and stands by you during difficult times. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from people who refuse to treat you with basic respect and dignity. Build your own path, surround yourself with people who genuinely care about your well-being, and never look back with regret. Your real family will always find you when you're ready to receive genuine love. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. And remember, you deserve so much better than settling for crumbs of affection from people who should have protected you from the very beginning.